May 14th, 1832. On the banks of a small creek in northern Illinois, a military force disintegrates. 275 mounted volunteers, the pride of the Illinois frontier, are in a full-blown, panicked retreat. They are not fleeing a superior army. They are fleeing from a handful of desperate warriors they outnumber by at least 5-1. The engagement would last mere minutes, but its name would echo in mockery for a century. Stillman's Run. It was the first battle of the Black Hawk War, and it was a humiliating, inexplicable defeat for the United States. This is the story of how that happened. It is the story of two leaders on a collision course. One, the Sauk war chief Black Hawk, a respected traditionalist driven to reclaim his homeland and feed his starving people. The other, Major Isaiah Stillman, an Illinois militia officer with political ambition but no combat experience. Their encounter at what was then called Sycamore Creek would ignite a war that neither man truly wanted, a conflict born from decades of broken promises, cultural blindness, and catastrophic military incompetence. It was the moment a final, fragile chance for peace was shattered by a single gunshot, unleashing a war of unforeseen brutality. To understand the fire that erupted in 1832, one must trace its embers back nearly 3 decades to a treaty that would become the foundation of the conflict. In 1804, in St. Louis, a small delegation of Sauk and Fox leaders signed away their patrimony. The Treaty of St. Louis ceded 50 million acres of ancestral land to the United States in exchange for a one-time payment of goods and a small annual annuity. For the rest of his life, Black Hawk would furiously contest its legitimacy. He argued the chiefs who signed it had no authority to sell tribal lands and did not understand the full implications of what they were doing. The Americans had secured a legal pretext for removal through what the Sauk considered trickery and fraud. At the heart of this stolen land was Saukenuk. Located at the confluence of the Rock and Mississippi rivers, it was the principal village of the Sauk people. A bustling community of over 100 lodges surrounded by fertile cornfields and rich hunting grounds. For Black Hawk, Saukenuk was more than a home. It was the spiritual center of his world, the resting place of his ancestors. Its loss was an existential wound. The American pressure to enforce the 1804 treaty created a deep and fatal rift within the Sauk nation itself. On one side stood Black Hawk, the traditional war leader who had fought alongside the British in the War of 1812 and deeply distrusted the Americans. He advocated resistance. On the other side was his younger rival, Keokuk. A gifted orator and pragmatist, Keokuk argued for accommodation, believing that armed resistance against the overwhelming power of the United States was suicidal. This internal division, a struggle between resistance and appeasement, crippled the Sauk's ability to present a united front, a weakness the Americans would expertly exploit. In 1831, the pressure became unbearable. Under threat from the U.S. Army, the Sauk were forced to abandon Saukenuk and move west across the Mississippi into present-day Iowa. The new lands were unprepared. The tribe struggled to clear enough acreage for their crops, and the winter of 1831 to 1832 was exceptionally cruel. Starvation stalked the lodges of Black Hawk's people. This desperation is the key to understanding what happened next. The return to Illinois in April 1832 was not an invasion. It was an act of survival. On April 5th, Black Hawk led his followers back across the Mississippi. But this was not a war party in the traditional sense. Of the roughly 1,000 people in his British band, only about half were warriors. The rest were women, children, and the elderly, traveling with their possessions and the seeds they intended to plant. Their stated goal was simple and profound: to return to their ancestral lands and grow corn, to stave off another winter of starvation. Black Hawk's desperate gamble was not made in a vacuum. It was fueled by false hope, a mirage of support constructed by his own advisors. His lieutenant Pope and a charismatic Ho-Chunk prophet named Waboki Sheik, or White Cloud, had assured him he would not be alone. They spun tales of a grand confederacy. Other tribes like the Potawatomi and Ho-Chunk would rise up and join his cause. More importantly, they claimed that Black Hawk's old allies, the British in Canada, would provide guns, ammunition, and supplies. This long-standing alliance, dating back to the War of 1812, was why his followers were known as the British Band. They even crossed the Mississippi flying a British flag. But the promises were phantoms. Upon arriving in Illinois, Black Hawk's grand vision collapsed. The British offered no assistance. The Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi, fearing American military power, refused to join his cause. The chain of events that followed was a direct result of this cascading failure. The flawed 1804 treaty provided the pretext for removal. The removal led to starvation. The starvation prompted the return, and the return, based on the false promises of his lieutenants, led Black Hawk directly into a fatal confrontation. By mid-May, isolated and with his people still starving, Black Hawk understood the truth. His plan had failed. His only remaining option was to negotiate a peaceful surrender and a safe return to Iowa. This was his state of mind as an American militia force drew near. Regardless of Black Hawk's peaceful intent, the news of 1,000 Native Americans crossing the Mississippi sent a shockwave of panic across the Illinois frontier. Exaggerated reports flew from one settlement to the next, painting a picture of a massive invasion. Settlers abandoned their homesteads and fled to the safety of blockhouses and forts. Illinois Governor John Reynolds, a politician sensitive to the fears of his constituents, saw a crisis but also an opportunity. He issued a call for mounted volunteers to coerce Black Hawk's band into submission. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of citizen soldiers enlisted, forming a hastily assembled army. Among them was a lanky 23-year-old captain of a company from New Salem, a man named Abraham Lincoln. But this was not a professional army. It was a volatile collection of restless men, contemptuous of discipline, eager for a fight, and deeply suspicious of all Native Americans. At the head of one of these volunteer battalions was Major Isaiah Stillman. A trader by profession, he had risen through the militia ranks to become a brigadier general-elect, but he had never seen a day of combat. He was ambitious and, like many of his men, eager to win glory by finding and defeating the enemy. The stage for disaster was set by a catastrophic failure in the military chain of command. The overall militia commander, General Whiteside, refused to formally integrate Stillman's unruly battalion into his main force, effectively leaving it orphaned. This left Stillman operating under the direct and distant authority of Governor Reynolds himself. Bypassing the professional military leadership on the ground, Reynolds gave the inexperienced Stillman permission to advance independently up the Rock River on a reconnaissance mission. This decision was fatal. It created an independent unit with no direct oversight, led by a commander with no experience and composed of troops who were ill-trained and psychologically primed for violence. The militia's greatest weakness was not their lack of training, but their mindset. They were overconfident in their own superiority, suspicious of any Native American gesture, and, according to several accounts, fueled by whiskey. This volatile combination made them utterly incapable of correctly interpreting a complex situation. They were a tinderbox, and they were marching directly toward a spark. On the afternoon of May 14th, Black Hawk learned that Stillman's militia was camped just a few miles away. With his hopes for allies and provisions dashed, he made a final attempt at peace. His goal was no longer to stay, but to negotiate a safe passage for his people back across the Mississippi. He dispatched 3 warriors carrying a white flag of parley to Stillman's camp. As a precaution, he sent 5 more warriors to a nearby ridge to observe the proceedings from a distance.
At Stillman's camp, the arrival of the 3 emissaries was met not with protocol, but with confusion and hostility. The militiamen, lacking a proper interpreter and already on edge, detained the peace party. Then, someone spotted the 5 observers on the hill. In the militia's paranoid mindset, this was not a prudent observation post. It was proof of a trap. Panic erupted. Shouts of treachery filled the air. Without warning, a shot rang out. One of the peace emissaries fell dead. The other 2 wheeled their horses and fled for their lives. The universal symbol of truce was violated. The point of no return had been crossed. Chaos consumed the militia camp. Without any orders from Major Stillman, a disorganized mob of soldiers mounted up and gave chase, racing recklessly after the fleeing emissaries and the observers on the hill. They thundered north, straight toward Black Hawk's main encampment. Black Hawk had only moments to react. Hearing the shots and the frantic report from his returning scouts, he knew diplomacy had failed. With only about 40 warriors immediately at his disposal, he demonstrated the tactical brilliance of a seasoned commander. He ordered his men to conceal themselves in the brush and trees, setting a simple but deadly ambush. As the charging militiamen galloped headlong into the trap, Black Hawk's warriors rose as one, unleashing terrifying war cries. The psychological shock was instantaneous and overwhelming. The overconfident volunteers, who expected to run down a few fleeing men, suddenly found themselves facing a ferocious, disciplined counterattack from what sounded like a much larger force. Their courage evaporated. Command and control ceased to exist. Major Stillman completely lost control of his men. The charge degenerated into a frantic, every-man-for-himself retreat. The disciplined assault of the warriors, combined with the militia's own panic, created the illusion of an overwhelming native army. Survivors would later claim, absurdly, that they had been attacked by thousands. The rout was on. Amid the pandemonium, one small group of men refused to run. Captain John G. Adams of Tazewell County, along with about a dozen of his men, made a desperate last stand on a small rise south of the camp. Fighting by the light of the moon, they held their ground, covering the retreat of their panicked comrades. Their bravery cost them their lives. All 12, including Captain Adams, were killed, buying time for the rest of the battalion to flee into the darkness. The next morning, May 15th, the main body of the Illinois militia, including General Whiteside and Captain Abraham Lincoln's company, arrived at the scene of the debacle. They found a deserted camp littered with abandoned equipment, and on the small hill where Adams had made his stand, they found the bodies of the 12 fallen militiamen. They had been scalped and mutilated, a grim testament to the fury that had been unleashed. Lincoln, who had enlisted for adventure, was now confronted with the brutal reality of war. He and his men were tasked with the grim duty of burying their comrades in a single, common grave. The experience left a profound mark on the future president, a visceral memory of the cost of conflict. The panicked survivors of Stillman's run fled 25 miles back to the main camp at Dixon's Ferry, spreading wild, exaggerated tales of a terrible slaughter at the hands of a massive Sauk army. Their stories ignited a firestorm of terror across the state. The humiliating defeat completely demoralized the first wave of volunteers, and many deserted, wanting only to go home and protect their families. For Black Hawk, the stunning tactical victory was a strategic catastrophe. It destroyed any last hope of a peaceful resolution. Convinced that the Americans were treacherous and could not be trusted, he now felt he had no choice but to fight, to avenge the killing of his emissaries under a flag of truce. He was now committed to a war he never wanted and had no chance of winning. His victory sealed his fate. For the United States, the defeat was an intolerable insult that demanded an overwhelming response. The panicked false reports from the survivors created a political reality that was completely divorced from the truth of Black Hawk's small, starving band. This false reality then became the justification for a massive military escalation. Governor Reynolds called for a new, much larger army. The federal government mobilized regular troops. The conflict was transformed from a regional policing action into a full-scale war of removal and extermination. The runaway militia had created a runaway war. The Battle of Stillman's Run was the fatal spark that ignited the Black Hawk War. It was a moment where incompetence, fear, and cultural blindness conspired to destroy a final chance for peace. It created a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy. The Americans, panicked by false reports of a massive invasion, reacted with a level of force utterly disproportional to the actual threat. The militia's failure and then subsequent lies created the political climate necessary for the disproportionately violent end of the war. The monument marks the grave of 12 men, but it also stands as a testament to a much larger tragedy. This small, almost forgotten skirmish was one of the most consequential moments in the history of the American frontier. It is a timeless and tragic lesson in how quickly mistrust can turn to violence, how fear can fabricate its own reality, and how a small fire left unchecked can burn down an entire forest.